Hello, thank you for coming. Thank you for watching, if you're watching the webcast. The United Planet Faith and Science Initiative, my organization, is very proud and pleased to bring the Climate Matters TV series to the COP. I'm your host, Stuart Scott. We are TV in a press conference, or a press conference masquerading as TV. Take your choice. And we're coming to you from the Conference of Parties, COP22 in Marrakesh, Morocco. Here's my email address. I like to give it at the beginning and the end so that if you have questions for our guest, you can forward them to me, and I will forward them on. So today's show is a conversation with Jeffrey Sachs, who certainly needs no introduction to this audience, but I will introduce him anyway. And today's topic, sustainability, prove it. Today's guest, again, Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the UN SDN, Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and the former director for many years of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. He's world-renowned professor of economics, a leader in sustainable development, senior UN advisor, best-selling author, and syndicated columnist whose monthly newspaper columns appear in more than 100 countries. Co-recipient of the 2015 Blue Planet Prize, the leading global prize for environmental leadership. Twice been named among Time Magazine's 100 most influential world leaders. I could go on, there's more. I want to get to our guest. One of his books, of his many books, how many have you written?
I don't know the count.
Lost count.
A number.
Just a few of his many, many books. Now, the first question, which I'll call the elephant in the room, I've heard it asked in one form or another at almost every press conference I've attended here. How can we maintain sustainability momentum through a Trump presidency?
Well, we're going to have to keep doing what we're doing, which is uniting the world. We have every country in the world represented at COP22. Every country in the world agreed at COP21 on the Paris Climate Agreement. Every country in the United Nations, 193 member states, agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals. They're so important that I don't think that any individual or individual country or individual president is going to derail them.
That's an interesting response. The United States, we're both American, and the United States has this national ego. We think of ourselves as the leader of the world, but perhaps our next leader will take us down a few pegs from that.
Well, I don't think the United States is the leader of the world anyway. We have 320 million people, but the world has 7.345 billion people. And so we're about 4.4% of the world's population. The recent estimate is that we're about 16% of the world economy. So there are 95.6% of the population that is not United States, and there is 84% of the world's population that is not the United States, and there are 192 UN member states that are not the United States. So I would like the U.S. to be one of the countries of the world. It is not the indispensable state, despite the fact that President Obama uses that phrase and others use that phrase. It is a country that happens to be powerful, it is rich, it has big responsibilities, and it should exercise those responsibilities accordingly. But indispensable, let's just hope it behaves itself. Leader of the world, I just hope it cooperates. That's all I'm looking for.
Yeah. Let's maintain a global perspective, even though we come from somewhat of a myopic nation. By the way, Jeffrey asked that I not give him the questions ahead of time. He wanted to be surprised. This is not scripted. Now, for the lead up to my second question, I want to make an assertion. I maintain that there's an operating system to global civilization, and it's seriously flawed. Now, I don't know anyone who teaches or says that we have an operating system, but if you think about what would the name of that operating system be, what decides what gets done, what doesn't get done, who's a credible candidate for president or prime minister, my assertion is that the operating system of global civilization is known by two names. First name, money. The second name, economics. And in particular, the brand of economics we have is growth economics. Been in place for a long time, so all other schools of thought have been pushed out. Now, a few decades ago, a book came out, The Limits to Growth, challenging growth economics. It was ridiculed by growth economists, updated 30 years later, and the world was still tracking predictions made in that book. So, again, my assertion is that its meaning to us, how we consider it, how we deal with it in the world, is the operating system, from the richest to the poorest. Challenge a rich person to walk away from their money. Challenge a wealthy nation to make a substantial donation to an adaptation fund. There's resistance there. What we're doing at present is we're turning this into this. Money is a thought virus that is using humanity to reproduce itself. Money is turning this into this. So, my question, are there limits, and have we surpassed the limits?
I think we should start from the point that the world economy is a mix of many very important good things and also many dangerous things. The good things are that over the course of the last 2 centuries, the world has changed from a place where almost everybody lived on the edge of survival, where you name the country, there were famines, there was mass death, life expectancy was around 35 years. Diseases were pervasive, death was pervasive, to a world in which almost around 90% of the world meets basic needs according to the World Bank data, and where mass famine is still an affliction, but typically only in war zones right now, and where life expectancy has increased to about 70 years, and where even in the last 25 years, the number of young children dying has come down by half, from about 12.5 million deaths of children under 5 in 1990 to around 5.9 million deaths of children in 2015. These are achievements, and the achievements mean that life is quite good for a lot of people on the planet. There are 2 fundamental problems, however. One is that there are a lot of people left behind, and if not in dire, extreme poverty, in deprivation, discrimination, relative poverty, marginalization, lack of dignity, lack of legal status, endangerment, trafficking, many conditions. And at the same time, we know that our economic development model is a big risk to the physical environment as it is carried out right now. That's why the UN has adopted an appropriate concept that says we need to combine 3 things, not just look at the economy, but the economy, the social fairness, and the environmental sustainability. That's the concept of sustainable development. I believe that's the right concept. I don't think one should draw a conclusion from our present ills and say, well, we throw away the economy, that's evil, or economic growth is evil. I don't believe that. I don't think we should look at our social injustices and say, therefore, as some countries have tried, have a revolution that enforces equality at the point of a gun. Or because we have environmental ills, let's revert back to a pre-technological era. To my mind, those are all mistakes. What I do think we should do is achieve the goals that we have rightly set out, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. End poverty, end hunger, have universal health and education, ensure gender equality, safe drinking water and sanitation, universal access to modern energy services, modern jobs, modern infrastructure, reducing inequality among countries, sustainable cities, sustainable consumption and production. I think I'm counting through the 17 goals.
I was going to say he's one of the few people on Earth who
I better be. I'm
all 17.
I'm the UN's advisor on this. I better be able to do this. Making the world safe for climate change, protecting marine biodiversity, protecting terrestrial biodiversity, peaceful societies, and partnership. Those are the 17. Those are wonderful goals. Let's get on with it. And what I think it means is that this idea, stop growth or stop a market economy, in my view, is too simplistic, too categorical. Growth in my lexicon doesn't mean more tons of stuff. It means progress. Do I think progress is over? No, progress isn't over. I bemoan the fact that 1 to 2 billion people do not have reliable electricity. Do I want to deny them that? Say, no, it's no good. We've seen it. It's no good. No, I want them to have reliable electricity. So I want continued economic growth in that sense. But the concept that I really like, you asked, are there limits? Yes, there are limits. There are biological limits and there are moral limits. The limits that count, in my view, are what's sometimes called the planetary boundaries. And that means we must not put more carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that beyond a certain threshold are going to endanger us. And we're right at the cliff on that right now. We're near disaster. That's what brings us to Marrakesh, of course. Moral limits are that we have to treat everybody with dignity. We have to make sure that everybody's needs are met. We have to make sure that everybody's rights are observed. Is that utopian? No, that's just our job. Is it easy? No, it's hard. Is it guaranteed from one day to the next? No. But is it the basic challenge that we face? Yes. And can we work on it? Yes. Can we make progress on it? Definitely yes.
Now, I think you've already answered the next question. I don't think there's much more to add. How can we change the current economic system to something more sustainable?
Well, I think that's the objective that I mentioned, but the how to do it is really tricky. And you want to do things that keep the good and stop the bad. People sometimes say, well, technology has gotten us into a mess, let's end technology. I don't think so, because I know I work in places that don't have access to modern technology, and the kids die. People go hungry. People work from morning to night in backbreaking labor. Is that the kind of message for the world? No. So that's not the right answer. Stop international trade. Well, maybe, but I don't like it because I like my cup of coffee in the morning, and we're just not going to grow good coffee in Central Park in New York.
In a few years, we might be able to.
The idea of it, but if it gets that warm, Central Park anyway is going to be under several meters of water, so it's going to be hydroponic farming, unfortunately. In other words, we have to face the practicalities. We have to put limits on what we do. Markets work well, but they also wreck a lot of things. So if you're an ideologue on either extreme that say, I'm a free marketeer, you just have a big misunderstanding about how the real world works, because markets will not protect the planet and they won't protect the poor. But if on the other hand you go all the way and say, God, I hate a market economy, it should be closed down, I wish I could invite you back to what I saw in the Soviet Union in the 1980s and in the planned economies. It was miserable. And so we have to have the right kind of more sophisticated balance, that we put the limits where they're needed, stop wrecking the planet, understand the biophysical limits of an Earth that is stable and that works, and at the same time understand that the economy can deliver and has to deliver a lot of goods. We don't want a pre-monetary economy, by the way. You showed money, and we need money. Money's a vehicle for exchange. It's a store of value. But if it becomes the golden calf, if I may use that, then obviously if it's the idolatry of money, we're going to wreck everything. We've known that for thousands of years. So how to keep a focus that says, let the economy do its good things and stop it from doing the bad things is the field I study called sustainable development. I believe in it, and I think we can get some constructive answers out of it.
Good. Yeah. No, money is many things, and I wasn't proposing that we get rid of money, but just change the concept somehow, make it more in service to humanity.
People who live for money have a very constricted life. This is clear. And the sages have told us that for 2,500 years at least, and they were right. Whether it's the Buddha or Aristotle or Jesus or many, many wise people, we're very clear that if you just live for money, you're losing your humanity in the process. On the other hand, try to work in a place without money, you'll live in extreme impoverishment. And I can tell you there's no joy in that. That's a lot of suffering, and that's why poor people actually are right when they say, don't talk about no growth, what about us? we want progress. And that's not just foolish materialism, that's because the lives that poor people lead are incredibly difficult. And this has to be understood. You know, rich people who have all the pleasures of sipping coffee and strolling on the streets and going out for their food and having full security, and then talk about the fact we don't like growth, or what's the matter with all those lazy poor people, should understand that poor people are working 15, 16 hours every day to stay alive. From before the sun comes up, fetching water, fetching fuel wood, backbreaking labor in the fields all day. I've seen it. And I know how hard, I mean, I've seen it a lot, but I know how hard it is. So in that sense, I'm a fan of economic growth, but not dumb economic growth that's going to wreck the planet.
Okay, now I've skipped over two of the questions I had because you've kind of covered them. So, assuming nations keep their promises in terms of climate negotiations, in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, will that be enough? Are the INDCs enough?
Here's the problem. I think everybody, maybe except our president-elect, understands it, and I hope he understands it soon. He better. We're going to try to educate everybody as fast as possible. Coal, oil, and gas were a wonderful thing for humanity because they created an era of economic development. And as I said before, the steam engine, everybody was poor. Now, most of the world is out of extreme poverty. It was discovered about 140 years ago, however, that there is a side effect. And that is that because of the quantum physics of carbon dioxide, which is produced by combusting fossil fuels, the infrared radiation that is emitted by Earth is absorbed by the blanket of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's a side effect. It's a bad luck of quantum physics. So CO2 is transparent to sunlight, and it is absorbing infrared radiation. It warms the planet. It's good. The planet is not as cold as the moon. Even though we're equidistant from the sun, we get the benefit of greenhouse gas warming. But we're now changing the concentrations, and it's very dangerous. It's the odd fact, psychologically and financially and politically difficult, that what was very good for humanity in providing the energy for a modern economy turns out to be very dangerous for humanity at this point. That's an irony. That's the irony of modern life. But the good point is we have massive technological options which have been on display all week at COP22 of how to move to a zero carbon economy that still grows, that still achieves economic progress, but respects the planetary boundary of greenhouse gas concentrations. That's the beauty of our technological know-how right now. So you asked a question, are we making that transformation fast enough? Not even close. Because we signed the Framework Convention in 1992, and we proceeded to waste 23 years of bickering, did nothing until the Paris Climate Agreement. I mean nothing, basically. And now we have 1 year of operation of the Paris Climate Agreement, and we're seeing the curve of emissions at least seeming to stabilize right now. But we have to get it down to zero Net zero is what the treaty calls for sometime around 2050. And nobody's got plans that are deep enough for that right now. But one thing that is actually quite interesting, if I could mention it, in the Paris Climate Agreement, countries are supposed to do two things. One is to release their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, up to the year 2030. They've done that. There's a little progress, not very impressive, not very heroic, almost anywhere. But then in Article 4, Section 19, every country is supposed to release a mid-century low-emission strategy. I regard this as much more important even than the NDCs. At least they're equal importance. Because by looking at mid-century, you're supposed to get down to near zero. Now, here's a positive point. The U.S. government this week released for the first time a mid-century strategy. Bless them. Thank goodness. This is wonderful. There's a White House report now. Go look it up online for a 2050 deep decarbonization strategy, not from some academic, but from the White House of the United States. That's big progress. Now, there's going to be a new occupant, but when the new occupant comes in, the first thing he's going to find on the presidential bed, I'm sure, is the deep decarbonization report. And that's what he's going to read the first day and say, God, I never knew that. He's going to find out two things. One, we promised to decarbonize. Oh, okay. And second, we can decarbonize at low cost. And then President Trump is going to stand up and say, I'm the builder president. I want to have $1 trillion of infrastructure. It's going to be the cleanest, greenest, second to none infrastructure in the world after he reads this report. So there.
From your mouth to God's ears. Now, you partially covered this. What do you think about technical innovations, but in particular, a hot topic that we've covered in a few of our shows at this COP, climate engineering, geoengineering?
There is a meaning to geoengineering that says we can't really solve the underlying problems of greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to do something funny like put shades up in the space so that the sunlight doesn't reach the earth as much, or we have to put aerosols into the stratosphere so that we get dimming.
Or suck carbon out of the air somehow.
Well, so some kinds of geoengineering are absolutely terrifying to me, because they basically say, give up on the normal solutions and let's do something that's probably going to really wreck the planet because, oh, we forgot about that side effect. And by the way, most of these solutions, like the aerosols in the stratosphere and several others, couldn't even be conceptually solve many of the problems, such as the CO2 dissolving in the oceans and acidifying the oceans, which is a disaster that's underway right now. There's another sense of geoengineering, which I think is quite different. You could use the same word to mean engineering of the Earth's system so that we don't destabilize the planet. And so when my favorite engineers say, let's move from high carbon to low carbon energy, I would call that a kind of geoengineering. If you said, let's capture the CO2 from the air, combine it with solar energy, hydrolyze water, stick the H together with the CO and make hydrocarbons, that's geoengineering also, but of a very positive kind, because then we would have a safe, reusable fuel that wouldn't add to the net stock of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So I love engineers, by the way. I think I've tried to bring more engineers into the COP process because engineers make the systems that give us the quality of life that gets us out of poverty. And the engineers have lots of great ideas about how to have energy without carbon dioxide emissions. And I think that that's all a good thing. But if the engineers say we're going to put shades up in space or aerosols up in the upper atmosphere, please count me out. I just want to get the emissions down so that we keep to a safe planet. Okay. And what everyone tells me in the meetings that we had this week is that this is feasible, economical. I've studied this for 20 years, and I see lots of solutions on the horizon.
Now, we'll shift from technical to philosophical, perhaps. How do we change the current narrative, the story that society is telling itself that's creating this problem. And I want to cite an article, which is the thing on my laptop that I send out most, The Creation of Society's Shared Hallucinations. A very interesting 2.5-page article. But how do we shift that paradigm?
Well, I think we had the most wonderful narrative on this issue that we've had in Pope Francis's encyclical last year, Laudato Si', which is a magnificent document. It's directed for the whole world. It's not for Roman Catholics alone. He was very clear about this. This is a message to the whole world. It combines spot-on science, by the way, that I'm happy to give to my graduate students, with theological perspectives, philosophical perspectives, and policy perspectives. It's just a magnificent document, but it's a narrative that says, let's get our heads together to think holistically about the Earth's circumstances, about human dignity, about protecting the planet, and about acting in for common purpose for our common home. And I think that this is the essence of what we need to do. Pope Francis talked about, in an earlier message, talked about a phrase that I find very powerful called the globalization of indifference, where he said that our big problem is because we're bombarded by media, by materialist advertising, by short-termism, we have gone into a kind of indifference to absolute fundamentally important issues like our survival. And so we have to end the globalization of indifference. Well, I can tell you in my experience in the past year, in many, many meetings and discussions about Laudato Si' and meetings with religious leaders from many faiths, there is a commonality of perception, a shared view, a shared set of values that really goes to the core of us in a deep way. And that's what I think we need to tap. So one part of the narrative is reminding us of what's human and why it's worth it for us to fight for our survival and the survival of other species. The second narrative that I think is very important is to help people understand there are practical solutions that do not mean impoverishment, do not mean going back to an age of famine, do not mean the end of technology, do not even mean the end of growth, but mean sustainable development where we can put our knowledge to bear in a fruitful way so that we can really have an economy which is fair and just for all and which respects the planetary boundaries.
Thank you. I think we only have a few seconds for what will be the final question. How do we move people to action? And once wanting to act, what should our listeners be doing? What should people be doing?
Everybody should certainly know the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Go home and impress your parents, your children, your colleagues, your students, your teachers, and tell them to memorize them and to take them to heart. Because this is the world's shared commitment to decency. This is the world's shared commitment to inclusion. This is the world's shared commitment to sustainability. And then we have to say to our government, stop the stupid wars. This is driving the planet crazy. This is forcing millions of people out of their homes. Stop this Syrian war. Let's go to the UN Security Council. Stop the idea of these great powers that they're somehow indispensable or that they're world leaders. Let's banish that idea. We're all in this together. We don't want leaders, we want cooperators right now. We want everyone joining in to get this done together.
Very powerful, very inspiring. We've run out of time. Again, this is the Climate Matters TV series. I'm your host, Stuart Scott. Thank you very much for coming.